Hello and welcome to week 5. Within this week for ancient Near East and ancient Greece, we will be taking a look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. Now to start off with, we know very little outside, or at least we did know very little outside of the Hebrew narrative for the eras of the patriarchs and the Exodus and the wanderings in the wilderness. And with the United Kingdom, we see that David quickly defeated the Philistines and established the united monarchy around 1000 BCE. And as a military commander, he was known for his cunning ability, and he seemed to conduct himself in campaigns along the entire coastal strip, from Gaza all the way up to Phoenicia. He ultimately extended his authority to the Euphrates River in the north, and perhaps as far as the Red Sea in the south. But we always need to keep in mind that the Kingdom of Israel in its united phase was still a minor player on the global stage. While this was the strongest that Israel seems to have been, or near its peak in that very early golden age, it's still relatively a minor player. It's not a great empire in the global sense. But as people look back at his reign, the reign of King David, they do recall it as a golden age. David established his capital at the former Canaanite citadel of Jerusalem, which lay very conveniently at the northern border of Judah, close to the northern tribes. In using this fortress as his base, he successfully established a strong central authority. Among other things, he relocated the Yahweh cult to the capital, bringing it into closer association with his regime to enhance his own legitimacy. He also attempted to distribute the costs of his administration among the tribes, although most of his funding probably still arose from war booty and from external tribute payments. David was succeeded by his son King Solomon around 960 BCE through to about 922 BCE. Solomon was not as active militarily as David, but he didn't have to be. And he was also gifted, it seems, in trade and diplomacy. He forged alliances with Phoenician kings, with Egyptian pharaohs, and with Arab sheiks along the Red Sea. Solomon set about the construction of the palace and the temple in Jerusalem. He also extended the reach of the central hierarchy throughout Israel. He imposed taxes and established garrison fortresses, or store cities, at the center of each tax district. And along the frontier and the trade routes of the kingdom, the remains of fort complexes, such as Megiddo, they appear to date from around this era. And each of them displays a uniquely designed 6-chambered monumental gateway. Now, to construct his monuments, Solomon resorted to conscript labor, or what's sometimes called the prytany system. Each tribe was compelled to send laborers 1 month per year to work for the king. And many scholars believe that Solomon imposed tax districts only in the north, and that the southern tribe of Judah and of also Benjamin were exempt from taxes, as well as from conscript labor. And if so, this would have fostered some resentment among inhabitants of the northern tribes. Solomon also relied heavily on dynastic marriages to secure alliances with neighboring polities. And it's alleged within the Bible that he amassed 700 wives, so that's married to 700 women of royal birth or noble birth, and also of having 200 concubines or thereabouts. Numerous foreign princesses settled in the palace at Babylon, along with a sizable entourage of priests and attendants and dignitaries. And these immigrants brought their native cults, primarily the Phoenician, what's called Baal worship, or the Baal cult, and the emerging temple, the palace complex at Jerusalem. The forced labor requirements and the cosmopolitan character of Jerusalem started to cause some dissension among Israelite citizens, particularly among the northern tribes. And so support for this very early dynasty seems to have begun to be eroded. And at the demise of Solomon, this resentment erupted into open civil war. Now, along with the reemergence of the Iron Age hierarchies and complex societies, came the restoration of literacy and recursive institutions throughout the Near East. Written testimony about the social experiences and evolving worldviews of inhabitants survive from a number of societies. While many ancient Near Eastern societies labored to reconstitute and to remodel themselves according to the values of the previous era, the written testimony of one society, ancient Israel, challenged traditional concepts of political legitimacy, of human rights, and of polytheism. Unfortunately, our knowledge of the history of ancient Israel is based largely on one source, a series of books known as the Old Testament. Now, from a historical perspective, this massive work, or series of works, contains strands of information set to writing as early as the reign of King Solomon, but most of it was probably compiled during the Babylonian captivity, so several hundred years after the era that we're taking a look at this week. In its eventual form in the Old Testament, we still, though, have contained a historical account of the rise and fall of the United Kingdom, the United Monarchy of Israel. A body of law received by Hebrew prophets, material that was ultimately formulated into a broad base code of ethical requirements or laws known as the Pentateuch. And we also call this the Torah. And we remember we've talked about the Pentateuch or Torah already. And the poetry and the prayers of various Hebrew prophets. Now, it's unnecessary to stress the purpose of the Old Testament, that the purpose of the Old Testament was religious, but within there is also the political propaganda of the day. It's assembled first and foremost to teach the Israelites about the covenant between their God, Yahweh, and themselves. And it's framed in a way to create a sense of identity within the nation of Israel. And as a whole, the Old Testament stresses that Yahweh was consistently faithful to the promises to the Israelites, and that he expected them to remain faithful in their devotion to him in return. But ultimately and repeatedly, the Israelites fail to keep that faith. And so we have, after the reign of Solomon, we have the breakup of Israel into the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, difficulties arise when we try to distinguish historical information from matters of faith, particularly when there is little external information to corroborate the particulars of the Old Testament narrative. And as we've already seen, with respect to the Stele of Merneptah, we talked about that last week, when external source material does surface, it tends to confirm the general historical outline, however minimally that may be. Besides that, document additional inscriptions, such as the Mesha and the Tel Dan Stele, have surfaced in Jordan and at Tel Dan. Now, the Mesha Stele, also known as the Moabite stone, is a stele, so an inscribed stone that's set around 840 BCE by King Mesha of Moab. And Moab is a kingdom located in modern-day Jordan, so on the other side of the Jordan River. And Mesha tells of how Chemosh, the god of Moab, had been angry with his people and had allowed them to be subjugated to Israel. But at length, Chemosh returned and assisted Mesha to throw off the yoke of Israel and restore the land of Moab. Mesha describes his many building projects. And Mesha Stele, the longest Iron Age inscription ever found in this region, constitutes major evidence for the Moabite language and is a cornerstone of Semitic epigraphy and of history. The stele, whose story parallels with some differences, an episode that we see in 2 Kings chapter 3. But it provides valuable information about the political relationship between Moab and Israel within that century, and the extensive inscription also gives us some insight into how the ancient Near East looked at the northern kingdom. They refer to the kingdom of Israel as the House of Omri. And it bears the earliest certain extra-biblical reference to the Israelite God, Yahweh. So in a construction by a French scholar, it also refers to the House of David, which would be the House of Judah. So we have this description of the House of Omri, or Israel, and of Judah. Another stele that we have is a broken stele that was found in the 1990s in Tel Dan, so in northern Israel, and it consists of several fragments making up part of a triumphal inscription in Aramaic, left probably by Hazael of Aram Damascus, so farther to the north. But this Hazael was a significant figure in the 800s BCE and boasts of victories over the king of Israel and his ally of the king of the house of David. And it's considered to be the earliest widely accepted reference to the name of David as the founder of the Judahite polity outside of the Hebrew Bible. And through the Tel Dan Stele and the Mesha Stele, we have these references that show that these were acceptable titles. And each of these is contemporary with the era of the divided kingdoms, and each refers to the polities of Judah and Israel as the house of David or the house of Omri, respectively. And these demonstrate not only the names by which these polities were known to their neighbors, but also by the two kings, David and Omri, that they were indeed historical. Both texts, in fact, recount plundering expeditions conducted by neighboring kings. So for Mesha, the king of Moab, and the unnamed king of Aram, probably Hazael, into the territories of Israel and Judah, respectively. Now, apart from furnishing external corroboration of their basic existence, the texts provide a decidedly contrasting perspective to the narrative that we have in the Old Testament. The Old Testament narrative is about on the side of Israel and Judah, and here we have the counter to that. And in addition, Israel and Judah were both repeatedly mentioned as subjugated territories in the annals of the Assyrian Empire, including one inscription relief that portrays King Jehu of Israel. So he lived from about 841 to 814 BCE, bowing to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. Now, these points need emphasis because they helped place ancient Israel within the context of the wider Iron Age Near Eastern developments, insofar as specific details about the history of Israel and Judah are concerned. Now, we must rely almost exclusively upon the narrative of the Old Testament itself in order to make sense of everything, but when we do, we see and we get these small glimpses here and there, we see that they connect very nicely. And as one scholar has observed, were it not for that document, the series of collected stories within the Old Testament, we probably would know far more about less celebrated polities such as the kingdom than we would about Israel and Judah. So without the benefit of the Old Testament, in other words, the place in history of Israel and Judah would be reduced to those of other tributary states that succumbed to the expansion of early Iron Age empires. So they would be as mysterious as what the little bit that we know about the Arameans and the Moabites and the Philistines and the Edomites. So it's just because we have that extra evidence for Judah and Israel that they seem to rise in our modern consciousness. So I just want to talk a little bit now about the divided kingdom. And the divided kingdom really starts around 922 and goes to about 721 BCE. Within a matter of decades, this united kingdom dissolved into the two separate kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Open conflict erupted around 922 BCE when Jeroboam, the former supervisor of Solomon's forced labor gangs, challenged the authority of Solomon's son and successor Rehoboam. And the latter was attempting to impose arbitrary labor levies on the northern populations while continuing to exempt the inhabitants of Judah. In this effort, Rehoboam was supported by a prophet named Ahijah of Shiloh. And aided by neighboring polities such as Aram, that's Damascus in the north, and Edom, the northern tribes broke away to form their own separate kingdom. Jeroboam, who now assumed the throne as the king of Israel, not only established a new capital in the north, in Samaria, but he installed new sanctuaries for the national cult of Yahweh in Ethan and Dan, cities that were situated on the southern and northern borders of his kingdom. And these acts essentially rendered the succession irreversible. Of the two kingdoms, Israel remained the more populous and more urban, and was more closely connected to the ruling houses of Phoenicia, Damascus, Moab, and Edom. Judah remained more rural and more isolated. Its people adhered to the legacy of rule by the ancestral house of David, as well as to its claim to the temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. Now, scholars have argued that the separation was probably inevitable, and that the United Kingdom was a temporary development resulting largely from the success of David and Solomon. Although conditions in Israel remained more tumultuous than those in Judah and were punctuated by repeated instances of rebellion, mutiny, and intrigue, few really questioned the authority of the king. Kingship remained charismatically based and dependent on evidence that the king personally enjoyed the support of Yahweh. Now, the king that we need to be mindful of within Israel, of course, is Omri. Omri lived between 885 and 874, or ruled between 885 and 874 BCE. And King Omri of Israel became a significant regional power. Omri constructed the fortifications of Samaria, and he forged a crucial alliance with the king of Tyre by marrying his son Ahab to the Tyrian princess Jezebel. Ahab, who was from 873 through to 852, continued his father's work, establishing Israel as one of the strongest states in the region. He contributed the second largest contingent of troops and chariots to the military coalition that confronted, although unsuccessfully, the Assyrian forces of King Shalmaneser III at Kalkar in 853 BC. And this and other defeats, combined with Ahab's encouragement of Tyrian religious practices in Samaria, particularly the cults of Phoenician deities like El Baal and Asherah, incited a kingdom-wide rebellion instigated by the prophet Elijah. And Elijah persuaded Ahab's general Jehu to overthrow the dynasty, eliminating the entire family of Omri in the process. Now, although set in motion by external developments, this struggle has often been interpreted as a religious dispute between more tolerant Israelites, such as the ruling class, who were willing to pursue more inclusive forms of Yahwehism, and one that did not prohibit the worship of outside gods, and others, like Elijah, who insisted on a more exclusive worship of the Hebrew deity. And as we shall see, the pattern of this conflict appears to have repeatedly colored the perspective of the Old Testament narrative. Now, from here on, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah became vulnerable to the advances of the expanding territorial states to the east. including the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. The kingdom of Israel joined in the repeated rebellions of its northern neighbors against the Assyrians and was punished with an increasing harshness. The rapid succession of dynastic usurpation that occurred between 745 and 722 BCE probably reflects the unhappiness of the Israelite population with the hierarchy's acquiescence to Assyrian authority. And in 722-721 BCE, the Assyrian king Sargon II and Esarhaddon conquered Israel and deported the ruling hierarchy, the royal family, the nobility, and the warrior elite to Urartu, what is ancient Armenia, replacing them with settlers from other regions. In Urartu, the deported Israelites gradually merged with the native population to become part of the lost tribes. And after the collapse of Assyria, the Neo-Babylonian Empire extended its authority into the region and compelled the surviving dynasty in Judah to accept tributary status. Now, a little bit about the Israelite prophets. As urban centers developed, a considerable non-Israelite population is likely to have dominated their populations. A foreign princess at the palace was naturally accompanied by a sizable entourage of priests to venerate her native cult, the Phoenician Baal cult in particular, not to mention attendants, servants, business agents, and courtiers. And at the head of David's army stood mercenary generals such as his good friend Uriah the Hittite, presumably an immigrant from the Neo-Hittite Empire of Cilicia, numerous Phoenician artisans, merchants, and traders migrated to Israel to fulfill skilled labor tasks and to fill voids in the emerging economy, with the inevitable result that they attained greater affluence and higher social status than did the Israelite inhabitants themselves. In short, the attempts of King David and Solomon to construct an administrative hierarchy and to elevate the newly founded kingdom of Israel to the level of the neighboring polities inevitably induced social and economic dislocation that placed ordinary Israelite citizens at a disadvantage. And such problems were not unique to Israel, to be sure, but they were clearly incorporated into a narrative that portrayed Hebrew society as one divided between a foreign urban hierarchy and a native rural peasantry. Conditions changed little during the era of the divided kingdom. Both states, Israel and Judah, experienced prosperity until the late 8th century BCE. Although the gulf between rich and poor continued to widen, with many independent farmers losing their land and falling into agricultural dependency. The literature of the reforming prophets refers repeatedly to economic difficulties characteristic of subsistence farmers trapped at the bottom of a transforming economy, such as land shortages, indebtedness, including debt bondage, and the abandonment of the poor. Indebtedness and heavy mortgages on land result in insolvency, not to mention legal proceedings initiated by wealthy creditors, particularly foreign moneylenders, against overburdened farmers. The resentment felt by Israelite citizens against these proceedings is revealed by the complaints preserved in Isaiah and elsewhere of corrupt judgments rendered by judges acting in the interest of the hierarchy. And in the period of the united and the divided kingdoms, in other words, a formal pastoral society that viewed its destiny as being inextricably linked to the implementation of the will of its God, Yahweh, confronted head-on the inevitable consequences of complex societies within widening social disparities, tax burdens, and economic inequality. Now, to make matters worse, the populace regarded the kings themselves as the agents most responsible for having recruited these foreigners and for having elevated them to positions of importance. Since the hierarchy was essentially a product of the king's own devices, it effectively eliminated them as credible arbiters in disputes concerned with social justice or judicial redress. The pressures of so many converging forces culminated in a civil war at the end of Solomon's reign, and in the dissolution of the United Kingdom into Israel to the north and Judah to the south. However, the process did not end there, because the ruling dynasties of both realms continued to pursue Near Eastern models of urban growth and centralized political hierarchy. Redress by Israelite citizens was obtained by turning instead to the leadership of the reforming prophets. Now, as I noted earlier, most of the prophets were revelationally inspired individuals. Amos, around 760 BCE, was allegedly a Judean sheep farmer who moved to Israel. Hosea, around 740 BCE, was a baker, likewise dwelling in Israel. Since the moral inspiration of the prophets was unquestionable and their role in Hebrew society dated back to its beginnings, their legitimacy was unassailable even before the kings. Visionaries such as Elijah and Elisha in 860 BCE, and Amos and Hosea in 760 BCE, and Isaiah elevated the complaints of Hebrew citizens to the level of religious redress. Now, the prophets, as I've mentioned before, base their arguments on Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. And they explore some of the context of each of these figures. So we'll do that a little bit within class. Now, admittedly, we'll look a little bit at the book of Hosea. Now, the story of Hosea was he was living out a image of this unfaithfulness of the Israelite people for following the justice rules set out by Yahweh. And the way that he does this is by having his life be a story. So he marries a hooker, and the hooker goes out and sleeps with other men. And he continues to bring her back in loving kindness, even though she's unfaithful. And that is a way of sharing with the people the story that God desires them to come back to a place of justice within their society, rather than living in the unfaithfulness and unjust society that they are in. So that's part of that story. Now, within the context of Israel is the larger story of the superpower within history, and that is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So we can think of that as existing from around 912 BCE through to about 612 BCE. And The Neo-Assyrian Empire was, according to many historians, the first true empire. And the Assyrians had expanded their territory from the city of Ashur over the centuries, and their fortunes rose and fell with successive rulers and circumstances. In the Near East, beginning with the reign of Adad Nirari II in 912 BCE through to 891 BCE, the empire made their great territorial expansions that resulted in its eventual control of a region which spanned the whole of Mesopotamia, part of Anatolia, the Levant, down through Canaan and Israel and Judah, and down into Egypt. The Assyrians fielded the most effective fighting force in the world at the time. The first to be armed with iron weapons fully, whose tactics in battle made them virtually invincible. Their political and military policies have also given them the long-standing reputation of cruelty and ruthlessness. And it's argued that they were neither, well, some will argue that they weren't more ruthless than other ancient empires. It wasn't really until we see Alexander or Rome that we see anyone really kind of be as intense as the Neo-Assyrians were. Now, the kings of the empire, such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, are mentioned a number of times in the Bible as enemies of the Israelites, although the inscriptions of the Assyrians and the books of the Bible differ, sometimes dramatically, on how events unfolded between the two nations. This is most notable in Sennacherib's inscription regarding the conquest of Judah and the account given in the biblical book of Isaiah, of 2 Chronicles 32 and 2 Kings 18 and 19. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. The Assyrians themselves did not refer to this phase of their empire as Neo-Assyrian, but regarded it simply as another development in their history. According to the Assyrian king list, there isn't really a break between the rulers of the second millennium and those of the first millennium. Now, so just keep in mind, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is a modern designation. It's coined by historians based upon an interpretation of ancient inscriptions that suggest a change in the way that the empire was now ruled. Now, the date for the beginning of this period is also contested. But there seems to have been some political turmoil associated with the Aramean invasions in the 11th, 10th, 12th, and the 11th centuries. So when we assign a date around 912 BCE, we seem to have a good sense of that being a place where we have a bit of cohesiveness from there through to 612 BCE. And because that situation holds, now some scholars will argue that the Neo-Assyrian Empire really was growing from 912 BCE through to about 745 BCE, where it was then really became a true empire under Tiglath-Pileser III in 745 BC. But the same situation holds for the end of the period. In some scholars, they will cite the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire being in 612 BCE, where we have the fall of Ashur and of Nineveh, while others will claim 610 BC, where we have the final date because of all the cities by that time had been destroyed. In any case, we're dealing with transitions, and so we are setting the dates just based upon some of those transitions that we know about.